Good afternoon, Ohayo gozaimasu, and guten Abend to the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego on November 2nd, 2021. Our topic today is the election that just happened in Japan in light of elections in Germany and the United States as well. I am Ulrike Schaede. I'm a professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego and the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. We are at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. This is an international relations and public policy school. One of our degrees is a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our offerings, please visit us at gps.ucsd.edu. At GPS, we have a Japan Center called JFIT, and more information on JFIT is at jfit.ucsd.edu. If you go to that JFIT website, you'll find a tab called News and Media. Here you can sign up for our bi-weekly JFIT San Diego Japan newsflash, where we're trying to convey news that was not covered in the main news, but is nevertheless interesting about Japan. And right next to that tab is the Japan Zoominar tab, where you can sign up for upcoming events and also watch past events. If you go there, it looks like this. The JZ Gallery is divided into business and economy, politics, society, and arts, culture, story, and more, humanities. And in each of these brackets, you'll find gathering recordings of our past events. So today, of course, we're going to talk about elections, especially in Japan, with Axel Klein and Ken McElwain, who I'll introduce more. We will talk about roughly $80 billion worth of Asian overseas coal financing that China, Korea, and Japan have now agreed to stop doing. So there's a lot of money and a lot of interesting stuff about the background of coal power plants in Asia. And on November 30th, we'll talk about women in Japanese science, business, and politics. And I'll have Yuko Harakawa with me, who is currently the executive director of Riken. Please note that if you're in Japan, we're switching off daylight saving time this coming weekend. So upcoming events for you will begin at 9:30 Japan Standard Time. All right, so there's some more information about how you can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or on my website, thejapanologist.com. Please note that the Zoominar is recorded and will be on our website. So later on, we'll invite you to ask questions through the Q&A type-in function. When I read out your question, I will refer to you only by your first name to preserve your privacy. All right, and with that, I should stop my share and invite our guests. Here they are. We have Axel Klein and Ken McElwain. Hello, and welcome to San Diego. So let me introduce you briefly. I'll start with Axel. Professor Dr. Axel Klein is visiting with us from Germany, where it is 12:30 at night. So thank you for staying up for us. Axel is professor of social science of East Asia and Japanese politics at the Institute of East Asian Studies, or INEAST, at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany, which is incidentally my hometown. Axel earned his PhD and Habilitation, which is the German second PhD, at the University of Bonn, which incidentally is my alma mater. We never overlapped in these places, Axel. That's too funny. He served as a research associate at the University of Bonn for almost a decade before he joined the German Institute of Japan Studies in Tokyo, where he served from 2007 to 2011. And he's now, as I just said, professor in Germany. His focus is on election campaigning, demographic change, and the relationship of politics and organized religion in Japan. He'll tell us today a little bit more about his new research interest in the rise of populism in East Asian democracies. He has a series of books and also a very interesting documentary on Japanese elections. So you may want to look him up, and also a book on the Komeito, which will also be a topic today. So thank you, Axel, for staying up. It's great to have you. And our second speaker or guest or conversation partner today is Professor Kenneth Mori McElwain, who originally hails from Ireland, but is now in Tokyo. And he's a professor at the Institute of Social Science, or Schaede, at the University of Tokyo. He, after growing up in Ireland and then Tokyo, he moved to the United States to earn his degrees, first at Princeton and then a PhD at Stanford. He was assistant professor at the University of Michigan, and some of his experiences also include visiting fellows at Oxford, and he's been at Schaede since 2015. His research focus is constitutional design, political institutions, parties, and public opinion. He has more than 20 papers and books on these topics, and his current interest is how COVID is affecting things in Japan. So we'll talk about that too. So thank you both for joining me today. It's great. We have a top-notch audience. So let me suggest that we proceed as follows. We'll start with Professor Klein to discuss the outcome of the result and the winning parties. Before we turn to Professor McElwain for a discussion of the opposition party and what happened there, and then we'll open up the discussion. And audience, please get ready to type your questions into the Q&A, and I'll pick your questions and kind of weave them into our conversation. So with that, Axel, why don't you get us going?
Thank you, Ulrike, and welcome from Duisburg. Let me just sum up the election results in a few minutes. I think this was a rather uneventful election. There were only small changes in the balance of power. The Ldp Komeito coalition has been confirmed. Depending on the social media bubble you're living in, you may have expected a better result for the opposition, but they lost again. And after yet another disappointing result for them, we could conclude that there simply is not enough voter potential for left or liberal political parties in Japan. And if that was true, then that would mean the Japanese people simply want conservatives to rule them. But it's not that easy, I think. I read in yesterday's Asahi a comment by Sakaya Shiro, political scientist from Todai, who called the present party system the neo-1955 system, with a dominant LDP and a much smaller left-leaning opposition, both camps ideologically divided by security policy and the issues surrounding constitutional reform. And again, my understanding is a bit more complex. I will gladly explain it later when we discuss what I think is the Hyakumaen question, which is, can the Ldp ever be defeated? And if so, how? So a quick summary of key election results. The Ldp won 261 seats, 15 less than last time. 261 seats is exactly what is called a stable majority. Here is the technical term, the zettai ante tasu. Because the Ldp can fill all positions of chairpersons in the 17 standing parliament committees. This makes the legislative process highly predictable and smooth for the ruling coalition. Komeito, the junior coalition partner, won 31 seats, and it got one additional one from Reiwa Shinsengumi, and that's just an interesting little side story here. We can talk about this later. The coalition with the Ldp will continue, but it does not command a 2/3 majority, which is necessary to change the constitution. The 5 opposition parties that cooperated stayed more or less where they were before the election, except for the CDP. The CDP lost 13 seats, which is really disappointing for them. I think party leader Edano announced his resignation. And if I'm not mistaken, the CDP will elect a new leader before the end of this year. I think that was part of the news today. So what has also changed is the size of the Innovation Party, the Isshin no Kai, which grew from 11 to 41 seats and seems to have picked up what the Ldp and the CDP lost. There are a few well-known politicians who lost their electoral districts. Here are 4 of them. Amari Akira, he's still got a second-class seat via the party list, but resigned from his position as general secretary of the LDP. Ishihara Nobuteru in Tokyo 8, he lost and did not make it into the Diet. Ozawa Ichiro, this is an incredible number. He lost his district for the first time since 1969. Imagine that's a very, very long time. But like Amari, he got saved by the proportional representation. And then there is Tsujimoto Kiyomi, the former deputy leader of the CDP, who lost in Osaka and was not saved by proportional representation. Turnout was 55.3%. Again, not much change compared to 2017. In fact, turnout never reached 60% in the last 4 elections since 2012. So LDP and Komeito are doing better when turnout is low because both parties benefit from organized votes, while the opposition depends much more on floating voters, but many of which didn't even float to the ballot box this time. So that was a problem. But if you do a little math, you can see that even now the opposition gained more PR votes than the coalition. There is 2 million more, 29 for the opposition, 27 million for the ruling coalition. And that is, I think, one difference to the 1955 system. It's also a different electoral system, so you have to keep that in mind. You could also make the point that only about 20% of the Japanese electorate voted for the LDP in PR, and 80% didn't. That would be a correct statement. But just as correct, it would be to say 70% of the electorate did not vote against the LDP. That is also true. So you can pick your perspective here. A few other statistics. The share of voters voting for the LDP was larger among young voters than in any other age group. And if I understood you correctly, Kenneth, you're going to talk about this later on, but I think it's remarkable that 40% or more of those 29 years and younger voted for the LDP. And at the same time, no other age cohort had such a low turnout, 35% more or less, as these young Japanese voters. There will be 45 female members of parliament, down from 47. The communists score highest on female representation with 20%, but that's only 2 members of parliament. The LDP scores lowest with 7.7, that's 20 women. Vote disparity has grown and reached 2.09. In 2017, it was 1.98. The Supreme Court had set a disparity of 2 as the limit, but I think we do not need to hold our breath for any legal consequences to this. So what does this election result mean for the ruling coalition? Just to close, here are 3 points that I find relevant. Kishida seems safe for now. At least until the upper house election next year. His support rate has slightly increased to 58%. Komeito has done better than in 2017, both in terms of seats and in terms of PR votes, exceeding 7 million, though the party had wished to gain 8 million PR votes. So there are still 1 million. They're falling short. Komeito will continue to present itself as Axel Klein for the LDP, slowing some hawkish LDP policies down and accelerating redistribution of policies. Komeito will also occupy just 1 cabinet position. That's the Land and Transport Ministry. It's been there since 2012. If you look at the fact that Komeito contributes 14% of all seats to the coalition, then you could say, okay, we have a right to fill 14% of our cabinet positions, would be 3 positions. But Komeito has never claimed 3 positions. Apparently they are happy with just 1. And Isshin no Kai may cause trouble. Even though there was a deal between Komeito and Isshin regarding electoral districts in the Kinki region, Komeito clearly resents any involvement of Isshin no Kai in the governance work. But Kenneth, maybe you want to talk more about Ishin and the other opposition parties.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Axel, for that nice lead in. And of course, Ulrike and JFIT, the Japan Zoominar, for inviting me to speak today. I want to pick up on where Axel left off and talk about how the opposition fared, but with a particular eye towards the voting patterns of the all-important independents, those who don't claim any partisanship to a political party. I also have some things I can talk about regarding COVID, but I'll leave that for the Q&A and later. So going into the election, one of the things that I and I think many election watchers were interested in was how independents would vote. This chart, it's in, of course, in Japanese. I'll do a little bit of introduction. Is a public opinion survey done by by NHK, the public broadcaster in Japan, on October 11th, 2021. So about 3 weeks before the election, and it shows the distribution of party identification or party support. And what's striking, and this has been true pretty much over the last 5 to 6 years, is that the LDP is ahead by a lot. The Liberal Democratic Party is on the top left. They're polling at about 41% affinity. The main opposition, the Constitutional Democratic Party, the Rikken Minshito, that's here in blue, registers only 6.1. And at the bottom right, the Tokuni Nashi is the proportion who say they don't support any political party, and that's 36%. So the task for the opposition was, and I mean, certainly for the LDP and other parties as well, is how many of this 36%, those who don't support a party, can they convert to their side in the election? A second challenge, of course, is that no individual party is large enough to beat the LDP head-to-head, certainly across the country. And so there was a lot of questions about the effectiveness of coordinating election candidates among the left, so that, in total, they may have enough votes to beat the LDP and Komeito coalition. So I'll just pick up with some numbers here. I'm going to talk briefly about the single member districts, of which allocate 289 seats, and then the PR block on the next slide. So of the 289 districts, in 217, what are broadly construed to be left-wing opposition parties, the Constitutional Democratic Party, the Japan Communist Party, the Social Democratic Party, and Reiwa Shinsengumi, put forward a single candidate between them. So instead of splitting the vote, they hope to get their supporters casting a ballot for whomever from one of the 4 parties were running in the district. In 2/3, so in 67% of this 217, it was a straightforward matchup between the LDP Komeito, the governing party candidate, and the unified left. But in these districts, it was expected that the left would do better, but in fact, the governing coalition won 68% of those seats. The left won 28%. And the remaining seats went to other candidates. In 1/3 of these 217 districts, there was LDP Komei left and Ishin, the Osaka-based party that has been running more candidates across the country, including in about 2/3 of districts in Tokyo. Here, the LDP did less well, but the unified left didn't do that well either. LDP wins 55, the left wins 31, and Ishin picks up 14%, most of that in Osaka. So how did the independents vote? The major media companies and newswires conducted a joint exit poll at the election. And what they found is that the LDP polled at about, so this isn't about voting behavior. The question is, regardless of who you voted for, which party do you tend to support long-term? And here the LDP is at 41, the CDP is at 17, and independents are at 15. So if you contrast with before the election, the LDP stayed flat at 41. The number of independents fell to about half, from 36%, more than half, 36 to 15%, and the CDP gained some. It's of course hard to compare polls done at different time periods and by different companies, but the CDP seems to have claimed some of the independents going into the election. So how do they vote, the independents? What we find is, so we have data from 2017 and data from 2021. For the LDP, they didn't particularly gain or lose many of the independent votes. The Constitutional Democratic Party, by contrast, increased its share from 13 to 41%. This is a little bit of a Pyrrhic victory in some ways, because the reason they gained a lot of independent votes is simply that the left had unified its candidates. So it wasn't fragmenting as much with the communists, let's say. It also, I think, picked up a lot of votes from independents who, in the last election, cast their ballot for the Party of Hope. I don't know if you guys remember them. They were supposed to be the new big thing, and they don't exist anymore. That's something that happens a lot when we observe Japanese politics, I think. So I think the hope used to be perhaps trying to angle itself as a party for disaffected independents / centrists. Some of those went to the CDP, but also to Ishin. How about the PR bloc? Here again, this Axel already touched on this, so I won't belabor the point. But comparing 2017 to 2021, the LDP gained a bit, Komeito gained a bit, the CDP gained a bit, Ishin gained a lot. So in the PR bloc, where voters don't have to be as strategic, they tend to cast their ballot for whichever party they like. What may have been Hope voters in 2017 seem to have moved more towards Ishin. Again, looking among independents here, LDP didn't change very much, Kome didn't change very much. The CDP lost quite a bit. They dropped about 8% compared to 2017. Ishin, on the other hand, doubled their share of independents from 9% to 18%. So one way to think about it is that Ishin has become perhaps a receptacle for this disaffected voters that went to the Party of Hope. And I'll end sort of very quickly along these points. The problem with the unified left is that to some extent, particularly in the single member districts, they were able to win over independents during elections. But for them to have any long-term prospects, they need to convert those independents into reliable left-wing partisans. So it can't be a marriage of convenience or something that happens during elections. They need a stable support base. But I think ultimately the data shows that the CDP and JCP are not sufficiently popular. And I'll just show you one slide. This is going to look messy, but I'll try to explain it quickly. So this is a post-election survey that I and my colleagues at Schaede, the Institute of Social Science, have run immediately after the election. So we're still finishing up the collection of data, but we have about 4,000 respondents. And these are people that we've been tracking over time. So we've been serving the same people for about a year and a half now. And what I'm showing here is among independents in our sample, which is about 33%, and those who are not independent, so they have a party they like, I'm showing their affinity towards different political parties. We asked them to rate parties on a 10-point scale. So 5 means neutral, above 5 means higher. So the left partisans isn't that interesting. You know, the LDP is above 5, but that's largely because I think LDP supporters like them. What's interesting is how well Ishin does, and Ishin is a pink. Even among partisans, which includes many non-Ishin supporters, Ishin has a fairly high rating, above 5. If we look among independents, you know, the LDP and CDP is about the same, but again, we see that Ishin is higher, although no party goes above half. So I don't know how long Ishin's popularity is going to last, but it does seem like they've positioned themselves as a non-left alternative to the LDP. Later on, I'd be happy to talk about whether or not this is a long-term vote basis or reflect the glory of Governor Yoshimura from Osaka, who is very popular at the moment due to his handling of COVID. So let me end here. I've gone on a little bit too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great introduction. And so let me, I have a few questions, and then the audience is beginning to type their questions in. So let's begin the conversation. The first thing I would like to ask you is, there's a lot of information that you just gave us here, but what were the things that you were most surprised by? So that you were watching this, would you say, wow, I did not expect this? Axel, you wanna maybe take one?
Yeah, thank you. There wasn't really a lot that surprised me. I had hoped for a slightly different result, not because I'm in favor of any of these parties, but because I thought it would make things a little bit more interesting for us looking at this. And as I realized, my social media bubble is a bit heavy on left-leaning politicians. I don't know how that ever happened, but looking at the enthusiasm that Reva Shinsengumi put on the street, especially Yamamoto Taro himself, but also other parts of the left, I think I was surprised that they didn't do better. I again learned a lot about Japanese voters. Kenneth just said the key sentence that apparently Ishin is a non-left alternative to the Ldp. And I think as a conservative alternative to the Ldp in opposition, you can only be successful if you keep on criticizing the Ldp. If you somehow try to align with them or offer yourself as a coalition partner, that won't work. But apparently, if you do like Ishin did criticize the Ldp, then you have quite some perspective, I think.
Ken, how about you?
Yeah, so I think the varying media companies were doing surveys of districts as the campaign period went on. And there were signs, particularly as the election day approached, that the number of districts that were too close to call had increased. I think the estimate was about 80, and it was too close to call because it looked like the unified opposition candidate was climbing up. So I think that increased enthusiasm for the election, certainly among election watchers. But in the end, the opposition was unsuccessful in winning a lot of these what was predicted to be close districts. It could be that the predictions were off. They weren't that close to begin with. But I think one thing I was a little bit surprised by is that I thought voter turnout would increase. And generally higher voter turnout tends to help the left because left-wing voters don't mobilize as much. But it was the third lowest turnout in the post-wars, higher than the last election, but still at about 55, 56%. And we expect higher turnout when election races are expected to be closer. But despite the media reporting that elections were going to be close, that didn't really happen. So I'm surprised by the turnout and how many, what appeared to be winnable seats, the left was unable to obtain.
So
if
this
I
actually
just may jump in here. I saw on the website of Tokyo Shimbun a graph that said that 31 single seat districts were indeed very close, where the opposition lost by 10,000 or less votes. So maybe that is one of the hidden stories that you don't see if you don't look closely at all the electoral districts, and we simply haven't had time to analyze all of them.
Yeah, that actually answers Joe's question, because she wanted to know what the average margin of loss was in the 67% coordinated districts. And so we don't quite know that yet, right? But is it possible that this is actually much closer than meets the eye?
I think so. So there are districts that were closer than expected and districts that weren't. And Axel mentioned this in his presentation, but a lot of bigwigs lost their seats. Amari Akira on the Ldp side, although he was resurrected in the PR, but Ishihara Nobiteru, who wasn't even resurrected in the PR. And so it's clear that on a certainly district by district basis, or in certain regions, there was momentum on the left. But at the same time, on a broader national scale, that didn't happen. And of course, the story ended up becoming, the LDP lost seats, but they lost fewer than was expected. So it's almost like a victory for them. While the unified opposition, particularly the Constitutional Democrats, lost seats, and so Edano as leader had to step down, while Ishin is the party now, or not the party, by which I mean the party that everybody wants to gather around and talk about. And I don't know how much longer it'll last, particularly because I don't know how close they want to be to the LDP. Much like Axel said, to be a credible centrist kind of conservative alternative, they need to be critical of both sides, both the LDP and the left. But that also means that they can be hit by both sides as well.
So Axel, you raised a question, if I may, I want to just give it right back to you, which is the $1 million question or $100 million question or Mackerman question, which is, can the LDP ever be defeated? And if how? I mean, this looked promising, and yet here we are again with a very expected, well, actually better than expected outcome. And so what would it take? I mean, why is this? Axel, you have an idea? You want to be a party strategist for a moment and tell us?
Yeah, if I would get a lot of money from the opposition, and I'll tell you, but yes, I think if we look at 1993, 94, there were a lot of things going on. At the end of the Cold War, the economic bubble had just burst. You had the recruit scandal still lingering on. You had the war in Iraq. And I think a lot of people in the LDP realized that the world had changed so much that Japan needed to adapt, and they thought that the LDP simply wasn't able to do that. So they left the LDP, they formed new parties. And we know the result of the election in 1993 with this 7 or 8 party coalition after decades of just a single party government. That was exceptional, I think, in many ways. 2009 with the DPJ was a bit less exceptional. And I think there we had still a number of factors. We had this missed pension record scandal of Abe. We had the DPJ that had been growing for quite some years and been successful in the 2007 upper house election. And I think that somehow created or helped to create the atmosphere that we need to try something else. Let's try something else. I remember a lot of people saying that in 2009, and then the DPJ won this election by mobilizing a lot of people. I think election turnout back then was close to 70%, which was remarkable. So if you have a LDP with a really bad performance, if you have a scandal there or conflict with rural regions, whatever, if you have a major, let's call that an external shock, and maybe the pension records were an external shock. Maybe in the future, a natural disaster or some climate crisis can produce such a shock. If you have these two factors going, and then if you have an opposition, and here I'm really undecided. I don't know if working with the communists is a good choice or a bad choice, whether it helps you more or it does more damage. For a while, I thought maybe with the communists, this is a bit like with Komeito in 1999. In Komeito, a lot of people couldn't imagine to vote for Komeito, but suddenly the party was part of the coalition. And then with the years, people lost this Sukyo wa yabai and Komeito, we better don't vote for them. And I think these days, a lot of people don't even think about religious organization in the background of Komeito, especially younger people. And I thought maybe with the Communist Party is the same. Maybe people don't think that they are voting for a socialist revolution when they vote for the communists. I think they don't. But still, newspapers are full of articles that talk about the allergy towards the Communist Party. And even though the Communist Party has really taken so many hits and agreed to withdraw their candidates, they're really much different from a couple of years ago when they ran candidates in every single seat district. and now they're really modest in the background. They don't even ask for inclusion into the cabinet. They say, we will be this kakugai kyoryoku, we will stay outside the government, just let us work together. I think that's very modest, but still it doesn't work. So maybe Kenneth, you have a particular perspective on this, but I, as a strategist, maybe would try next time to go a little bit middle of the road and keep distance to the Communist Party, just for a change.
Just on that point, I think the difficulty with coordinating with the communists is that it makes the Rengo, the National Federation of Labor Unions, the biggest labor union association in Japan, unhappy. They've long had a rivalry with the communists, and Rengo, as an organization, if they don't support it, it means that many union members aren't going to be as active in trying to mobilize voters for Communist Party candidates. And so perhaps the relationship with Komeito and Soka Gakkai, its main base, they were able to align or at least agree that voting for the LDP was necessary or useful. But I think the left, certainly at this point, hasn't been able to do that with the labor unions.
So I asked you about the surprises, and so two of the things that I was most surprised by, and in fact, we actually have some people in the audience who share the surprise, were Amari and Edano. Edano was the head of the CDP. He stepped down after this really poor outcome, and Tom would like to know why, whether you have any comment on that. And then Amari was in a very powerful position and failed to make it. And so doesn't that strengthen Kishida's hand in terms of shaping his cabinet office? I don't know who wants to take this. Maybe Ken start and then we'll turn to Axel.
Sorry, I'm going to show a slide really quickly again, and hopefully it'll be more illuminating than confusing. So earlier I showed you a slide that compared partisans and independents on which political parties they liked. We also asked a question about individual political figures. And so forget the left now, this is the partisans, but the right is independents. Again, the critical voting bloc for the left if they're to gain seats. So the people in blue are different LDP figures. The red are the varying opposition, and the blue and yellow are two governors. So if we take it from the LDP, so we go Abe, Suga, Kishida, and Kono. So I think Kono Taro, who lost the LDP presidential election to Kishida, in large part because he wasn't able to win the legislative vote in that contest, is quite popular with the public. Among any national level politician, he is most popular. What's sort of surprising, well, I mean, there are a number of surprising things. One is that Suga is more popular than Abe, at least in our sample. Kishida is more popular than Suga. But keep this Suga level in mind. So on a 10-point scale, he's at about 3.8. If we look at the opposition, the first red, kind of the pinkish red, is Edano. So Edano is as popular as Suga. That's probably not good long-term if you want to be the head of the major opposition party. I think there's a sense that he's been around for too long. I think there's a cap to how much he can bring in new voters, and fresh blood for the party, I think, is critical. But I'll also note Koike and Yoshimura. So the green is Governor Koike of Tokyo, the yellow is Governor Yoshimura of Osaka. And I mentioned earlier that he's quite popular related to his perceived handling of COVID. And he's not running for national office, but he's very active in campaigning around the country for Ishin candidates, the party to which he belongs. So I think while leaders don't determine election outcomes entirely, they do matter, particularly in this context where there were only 17 days between parliamentary dissolution to the national election. So I think Edano, even though he won, I think it's becoming quite clear that he can't do more for the party. I'll stop there.
Okay, there's little more that I can add, but if you look at the other parties on the left, if you look at the communists with Xi and the Social Democrats with Kusima, you wonder why they are still party leaders, because if it were up to what kind of election results they bring in, then there would be reason to exchange them as well. But apparently, I think Edano, maybe he just realized that he's not only now left with the responsibility for the unsuccessful cooperation with the Communist Party, although I think he never allowed pictures to be taken with him and representatives of the Communist Party, so he was careful there. But nevertheless, he takes responsibility, and I think he realized, or must have realized, that he's not the face and the person who can mobilize a lot of floating votes. Maybe there are other people who are better equipped to do that. I think that there can be people like that, is proven by Yoshimura in Osaka, right, of the Isshin no Kai. And he really hasn't such a long history of being popular. It sometimes takes very little to be popular.
So we have a number of questions on Germany. So I want to make this a little bit global, if I may, because unlike Japan, where there seem to be, in Germany, where there seem to be elections all the time, the US is always voting on November 2nd, which happens to be today. But this year is an off year. So there's a larger question about the three countries later. But Axel, there are a couple of questions that are directly for you, I think. The first is, Nobuo is wondering why there is no Green Party in Japan, just like the German Green Party. And that's obviously a longer question there of the Green Party also being a big surprise. They were supposed to be the shoe-in at this recent German election and managed to lose what was there to win. I don't know how much you want to go into that, but we have another question in terms of, what's the difference in voting behavior between Germany and Japan, and is there something there? Let me stop there, because then I also want to talk a little bit more about populism and Germany turning left. But let's take these one by one, maybe.
Okay, thank you. Great questions. I think number one, if we ask why there is no Green Party in Japan, we could also ask why is there no Populist Party in Japan? Because I think there isn't. Now, it depends on how you define populism, and I know there is some mostly journalistic contribution that claims that Reiwa Shinsengumi could be seen as a populist party, but it would clearly be a left populist party. And I think in general, when people talk about populist party, they at least superficially have something on the right in their mind. So Japan doesn't have that. And that's a really difficult question that I have not found a good answer to. The only thing that I could somehow think of is that in Japan, new parties mostly come into being within parliament. There are members of parliament that create new parties. Reiwa Shinsengumi may be an exception because it evolves outside of parliament, thanks to Yamamoto Taro and his efforts. But they're still small, so I don't know what kind of future they have. Maybe after 2 or 3 more elections, we can say that Reiwa Shinsengumi, after Komeito, is the first party that was founded outside of parliament and lived for a longer time. On the other hand, if you look at their PR votes in 2019 at the upper house election, and now hasn't changed. It's still the same 2.2 million people that support this party. So let's see what will happen there. In Germany, the Green Party, I think, failed. It was really an unsuccessful election for them. I totally agree. And I think that German media missed that narrative. And I think one explanation, maybe it's not the best one, but one explanation is their top candidate, a young and energetic, dynamic woman, but she came without any experience. She never had any public office. She had a career that was exclusively within the party. And I think a lot of people simply didn't have enough confidence to say that she could become chancellor. I mean, if you've never held any public office and then you're suddenly at the top of government, it is not that easy. And if you have an alternative to vote for, maybe you would do that. I think the Greens would have done much better if they had a different politician at the top. And then the question regarding voting behavior, the electoral system is a bit different in Germany. And it's always been that way. So in Japan, we have this electoral reform in 1996, first time that this new electoral system was used. Before that, people couldn't vote for a political party in the lower house election. It was always an individual that they have to vote for. But in Germany, people have been used to vote for a political party. And maybe they look at who would be chancellor. That was, of course, an individual point then, but generally it was the political party that people voted for. Because in Germany, we have a proportional representation system. Let's not go into the details, that will bore the hell out of you. But so you have a different electoral system. And I think that explains the very different voting behavior of Germans who would rather look at the political party. Manifestos, party platforms, are something that in Germany have been around for decades. And in Japan, it was a rather new thing in the late 1990s. I still remember watching NHK where people said, finally, we know what parties stand for, and we consider this to be a contract with the people. You remember that? When the DPJ said this is a contract with the people, it's not a manifesto. If you vote for us, we sign this and we will put all these things into laws. And then after a while, people realize, well, it may be in that contract, but political parties still don't have the power to push that through and realize whatever goal they have. I hope that answers the questions.
Now, could I just stay with you for one more question and ask, push that a little bit further? So knowing Nobuo, who is, I don't want to give him away, but he's known to be one of the most progressive thinkers on Japanese energy matters. So he's actually asking also a larger question, which is, how can it be that the young Japanese who showed up, you know, at this election, I guess, are voting conservative, as you mentioned, and why is there no appetite? And you know, so Wilfried actually has a similar question. What does a strong result for the LDP mean for the progress in climate protection? Right. So it's the opposite of the German reason. So Germany has gone away from, I guess, you know, has turned towards the Social Democratic Party. I don't know whether it's a populist party or not, but you're studying populism right now, Axel. Can you talk a little bit about, is there a meaning in the fact that the Germans have voted more towards the left and that Japan has supported the populist vote, although you claim there's no populism in Japan? So can you parse that out a little bit more for us? Will Germany and Japan be friends after this? Can Kishida and whoever is going to be the next chancellor, is it Scholz? Does it mean anything that they're, you know, farther apart?
I hope we can still be friends. I don't see any reason why we can't. I think this relationship between Germany and Japan is quite boring because there is not much going on. We don't have a lot of conflict between the two countries. I think the biggest conflict we have at the moment is that we can't get into Japan. So if anyone is listening from the Justice Ministry, please let us in again. I think the little concession that we got today announcing that business people can enter the country, that's not enough. I hope that at least all the students that are now allowed to come in, that they will make a difference and show that it's a good idea to open up again. But that was a political statement. I do apologize for that. So I think there won't be a lot of changes in the relationship between Japan and Germany. There is just today or tomorrow, depends on Wednesday, there will be a German ship, a frigate, arriving in Yokohama, and that will be one of the very rare occasions where German military is actually traveling through the Indo-Pacific and the region over there. And it's one of those attempts of Germany to contribute to the open seas and to free trade and to show that we share certain values with other countries in the region, like Japan, like Singapore, like Australia, et cetera, et cetera. So I think these symbolic policies will continue, and I don't see any reason why there could be a problem. Regarding young people in Japan, again, that's something that I've been wondering about for a very long time. From Japanese students and exchange students here in Duisburg who I've talked to about how they've been socialized politically, I find that maybe the Japanese education system and the way that people are taught at school how politics work, that all of these things don't really contribute to citizens that make use of the freedom that a democracy offers them. That turns young people into people who have a clear political opinion and voice this opinion and go on the street whenever there is a topic that they don't find dealt with correctly by the government. So I was surprised to see that the climate issue wasn't that important during this election, while in Germany, at one point I was under the impression that we're hardly talking about anything else but how to save the climate from Germany. I don't know how that is supposed to work, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try it.
So our colleague Ellis reminds us that we should also talk a little bit about the United States. And the way he would like to frame that conversation, and maybe that's for you, Ken, no one has mentioned the main dividing line in Japanese politics, defense and the US alliance. Didn't the tie to the communists and socialists on defense hurt the opposition coalition?
So I think it's possible. So one thing, and I'll connect this to the issue about environmental politics, is the environmental politics is divisive not just on the left and right, but also within the left, because it necessitates a discussion about nuclear energy and whether to restart a lot of nuclear reactors, some of which have been stopped since the 3/11 triple disaster a decade ago. So I think a lot of political parties prefer not to talk so much about the environment, even though it may be of interest to younger voters. But in our survey that we discussed earlier, we asked respondents to pick the top 3 topics that matter to them in their vote choice. And COVID actually came up the highest at about 44% of voters included it in their top 3. But if we talk about energy and environmental policy combined, it mattered to about 17% of voters in their top 3, and only 3% of voters included it as their top priority. So I think there's an upper limit towards how much voters care about environmental issues, at least in the election. Regarding foreign and security policy, about 18% of our respondents listed it as something that matters to them. But there's a big partisan divide. It matters a lot to LDP voters. It doesn't matter very much to the left and independents, who tend to raise issues like, the socioeconomic issues, like pensions and healthcare. And at least on a generational level, the biggest difference we see is not so much on the environment, but the relative weight given to pensions versus childcare. As you can imagine, older voters tend to care a little bit more about pensions, but younger voters, particularly those under 40, care a lot about education, childcare. Which is a way of saying it's not that people don't care about foreign security policy. It certainly does matter for the left and right divide, but it doesn't seem to have been forefront, at least in this election.
Well, Axel, let me reframe that same question and give it back to you. Actually, there's a question in the audience, very well framed, which is that in this and other recent elections, so whether that's Germany or the US or Japan, what role, if any, did national level issues, national security, policy, and so forth play as compared to international things like China or and then so Axel, I'll let you take that, and I want to bring COVID in because Ken, partially because you're working on that. So how do these countries compare in terms of what actually matters? And is this all a domestic story, or are some places more concerned about the globe than others?
Here in Germany, we do not yet have a new government. There are still coalition negotiations going on. We have three parties that want to be the new government, but they haven't agreed yet on how that is going to look like. And so far, we've heard nothing from them about any foreign policy issue. It looks like that's simply not relevant or important to them. And that's, I think, remarkable, especially because the Greens, for example, but also the Social Democrats are very strong on human rights. And people here start to wonder what will happen with the German relationship with China, because China is the most important trading partner for Germany, I think. And if the Greens really insist on, I don't know, whatever human rights issue you pick in China, then this may lead to enormous protests from the business community. So that's going to be a really interesting test for this new government. And it will be interesting to see how this foreign policy issue is relevant in German politics. And if we compare Germany to Japan, I think in 2017, under the Abe administration, shortly before the election, there was this one missile being shot by North Korea. I think we had a similar case this time, but this time somehow it didn't cause so much concern among the people. Maybe they're used to that, but I have a survey from Nippon Television where they asked people what is most important to them during this election, and number one is the economy, and number two is Corona, as Kenneth said, and then a close third is foreign policy. So maybe because Japan is surrounded not by friendly European countries like Germany is, but by countries who are less friendly. Maybe that's why people care more about foreign policy than they would in Germany. That's my guess, at least.
If I just add on to that, again, I think the shortness of the campaign, I know this is a question raised by some members of the audience as well. An election needed to be held by late October or November at the latest, because that was going to be the end of the term. And Kishida, I think, surprised many people by calling an election earlier than was expected, which is why there were only 17 days. But independent of that, campaigning by candidates in the lower house is restricted to 12 days before election day by law. Now, there are things you can do before that as well, but 12 days is a really brief time to talk about anything complex that requires nuance. I think the LDP is happy to talk about foreign policy because they're seen as having a competence advantage on the issue. But I think for the left, their hope was that if they slammed the LDP on what was perceived as poor handling of COVID and vaccination rollout, that it would help them. And that didn't seem to have happened in this election.
So on behalf of Professor Hugh Patrick, who's kind of asked me to channel him every single time, I'm going to ask this very big question about worry. And I want to preface it by bringing the US in. I mean, I think it's fair to say the US has become a little bit unpredictable. It used to be a rock in the stormy sea, and that we don't know. So we're voting today. It's just close. We don't know the results, and two states here will be seen as a bellwether of what's going to happen next year when this is becoming a really important thing. So, so keeping that in mind, what are you most worried about? And I'll let you frame that as you like, whether that's Japanese politics and domestically, or global politics and elections going forward. What is it that you would like us to watch intently and maybe want to think about? So, Ken, you want to start?
Actually, can I defer to Axel first? I'm going to get my thoughts in order.
Okay. If I think about Japan and the political system there is not much I worry about. I think as long as there is accountability and there are consequences for transgressions, then everything will be fine. And if I think about the last couple of years, I think if the Supreme Court says vote disparity has to be corrected, I think the government should correct it and not leave the problem somewhere up on the shelf. Ignoring constitutional rights of the opposition is also something that I think is a problem in Japan. I know there are reasons for why the opposition wouldn't get its diet session when it asked for it, but there's a right, and it's in the constitution. So the LDP should do this. I don't know about the claim of the opposition that there is an insufficient investigation to corruption charges. I'm not into that. But a final point, and that's something I would really like to ask Kenneth about, is one of the suggestions the LDP has for constitutional reform, because one of the points is to change the upper house electoral system and give each prefecture a seat. And that would lead to the abandonment of one person, one vote logic in the Constitution, meaning that vote disparity would grow beyond 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 even. And I find it remarkable that the LDP is doing such a blatant thing as part of constitutional reform, because it only helps the LDP because they are strong in rural regions.
Let me take that first, and then the broader thought. What's really remarkable, and I think perhaps what hurt the left in this election, is in 2017, there was some coordination, the emergence of the Constitutional Democratic Party, and a lot of it was justified and sold as a way to protect the Constitution from the LDP and the fear that Abe was going to make major changes without incorporating opposition voice. So there was both a strategy, let's coordinate, and then a justification that was easy to understand. I think in 2021, attention on the Constitution has fallen quite significantly, in large part because neither former Prime Minister Suga nor Kishida, I think, care about it as deeply as Abe did. So constitutional revision is still on the manifesto. I think they may try to do it. There were murmurs that they will try to schedule a referendum vote on it to coincide with the upper house election next summer. I frankly don't think there's enough time for it. And it's red meat, I think, to the conservative base of the LDP, but many individual politicians prefer not to touch it because it turns off independence. And maybe at some other time we can talk more about the upper house electoral reform. I don't think that's going to happen as a constitutional amendment. But the things I'm concerned about, I think one thing that may be different in, certainly from the United States and possibly in Germany, is in Japan, there's a sense that politicians didn't do that great of a job, or at least national politicians didn't do that great of a job in the handling of COVID. But I think there's a sense that citizens behaved well. They wore masks, they're getting vaccinated. It's, I think, approaching the highest rate in the G7 now. Social distancing is still the norm. And, you know, even outside, people are wearing masks. Maybe it's a little bit too much, but we all chipped in, even though there was no legal consequences for not doing it. And so there may be political mistrust, but I think civic trust has increased. And it seems to be a little bit different, certainly watching the news in America, where there is a sense that you cannot trust your neighbors. It's certainly it differs by state, of course. And that's the part that I'm concerned about in the United States, but less in Japan.
All right, thank you very much. Unfortunately, time is up. We have many more questions that I would have liked to ask. I'll share them with you later. And thank you, audience, for staying with us and joining us and asking these great questions. And thank you, Professors Klein and McElwain, for joining me tonight. It was a great sort of global thing, and learned a lot about this recent election. And I hope you come back in the future and teach us more about these very interesting things. So thank you, everybody. And we'll see you in 2 weeks when we talk about Asia's role in global coal plant construction financing. A very interesting topic. And until then, please take good care and stay safe. And with that, let me end today's Zoomina. Goodbye.
Cheers.
Thank you, everybody.